status quo. What are your major arguments for leaving?
Well, I think there is no status quo within the European Union, and it changes all the time, normally for the worse. You never know when it's going to impose a new regulation, so let's say the Clinical Trials Directive, sort of dropped in our laps. Very damaging for the NHS, raised costs, half the number of non-commercial clinical trials in the country, doubled the cost of cancer trials. Then more recently, you had amendments to VAT law in the digital single market, which ran thousands of sort of online startups out of business because they couldn't cope with the new system. There isn't a status quo in the European Union. There isn't any certainty in the European Union. And, you only have to go and look at the industries like fishing or like steel, which are being harmed by the European Union, to see that.
When we look at the British people, though, who would be voting on this in June to stay or to leave, how many of them do you feel are undecided at this stage?
I think a good number. The polls tend to always seem to show somewhere in the region of sort of a fifth to a quarter of the electorate is still make up their mind. I think it could actually be significantly higher than that. There's people out there waiting to see what the arguments are. They want to see what the government has to say. They want to see if the government has a case, a strong case, or if it is just building a case, as you've mentioned already, built on sort of fear, playing to people's fears, playing to people's apprehension about changing things. The government doesn't seem to be making a very good case, certainly not from our perspective. People don't seem to be buying into the case. We are slowly but surely turning the polls in our direction.
Can you give us a sense of where you're at then at the moment regarding popularity? If there was a vote today, what would the likely outcome be?
It's impossible to say, the polls, most of the polls at the moment show a slight lead to the Leave. There was a significant lead for stay in the beginning, but as time has wore on, as Cameron's go back to the people weren't particularly impressed by it. The polls have shifted in the direction of Leave, giving a slight lead to Leave, but with a significant chunk of people who are still in the don't know camp and who could sway either way.
What's the major problem with...
So there's everything to play for.
OK, but what's the major problem with David Cameron's compromise? Because the EU obviously wants Britain to stay, and there are several politicians who, and members of the public, who also want to stay. But David Cameron has tried to appease those in the undecided camp by coming up with a compromise. What's the problem with that?
Because there's nothing in the compromise. None of the big issues with the European Union, for example, the fact that there is an unelected commission in Brussels which sets EU law above national laws, which we can countermand. We cannot. There's nothing to empower us to control EU migration. We have no power to make trade deals on our own initiative or to cast an independent vote on important global bodies like the World Trade Organization. There was nothing really in is compromised. It got a terrible reception. I think something like 60% of the public polled said it was a bad deal, with a much smaller percentage saying they thought it was a good deal and decided. So that's the problem with this compromise. It's just this completely empty, non-binding, nothing in it, and it's not going to do anything to change any of the problems that we have at present.
The argument, though, is that the deal could be far worse if Britain is to leave, to maintain trade links with the EU, that would cost far more. Well, do you not worry about that?
No, not at all. Outside the European Union, I think we would have much more leverage when it comes to the likes of trade than we do at present. At present, there's countries we would like to be making trade deals with, Australia, New Zealand, our old partners in India. This hasn't been done. It would have been done decades ago, but it hasn't been done because it's been obstructed by other EU member states who outvote us in the European Council more often than any other country. Whereas outside, we would be the Eurozone's single biggest export market. They would be banging down our door to try to sign a trade deal because they have a whole lot of problems to deal with. The last thing they need is to be restricting their access to one of their biggest consumer markets.
But Britain does have a significant portion of exports going to other European nations, just over half, according to the goods statistics that I've seen. Is it not worrying
that...
It's about
43%. It hasn't been over half for some years. About 43%.
But solely on goods, though?
Probably lower.
Solely on goods, not including services?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's correct either. It might be, but then I would say I don't think that trade is not going to disappear. It's a bit of a non-argument. You know, the Remain campaign like to say how much trade we have with the European Union, how many people have jobs linked to trade with the European Union, but none of that would stop after leaving. You know, the European Union trades with tons of countries which are not European Union member states. South Korea has a brilliant trading relationship with the European Union. Free trade in goods, free trade in services, but no free movement in people and no unelected European Commission dictating South Korea's regulations to it.
Speaking of South Korea, we were warned by an analyst last week who was very cautious about the Brexit when he said that the whole world would be affected, including us here, that it would cause shockwaves. It's not your primary concern, I understand, but do you have any words of comfort to offer us?
I don't think that South Korea has anything to fear from the United Kingdom coming out of the European Union and taking its place on the world stage as a freestanding, independent nation, just the same as South Korea. We plan on being a sort of an open trading nation, a good relationship with our neighbours in Europe, and having a much more extensive, deeper relationship with other countries around the world, which we'd like to be more engaged with, but cannot be at present because the European Commission controls trade policy for us and blocks us from deepening our relations around the world. It's nothing for anyone to be frightened of. It's all this talk of a leap in the dark, shockwaves, years of uncertainty. It's the normal condition for every advanced economy around the world, which is not in the European Union, to govern its own affairs, to make its own laws, and to represent itself globally. It's perfectly normal, and there's no reason we should be afraid of it, and there's no reason anyone else should be afraid of us doing it.
But if the Grexit, the possible Greek exit, would have caused turmoil, surely the impact of a British exit would be far greater. That's how the argument goes.
Well, a Grexit would have been a sort of forced exit, a traumatic kind of split from the European Union, caused by the European Union's the total failure of the euro as a European Union project and the intransigent attitude of the European Commission and the Troika, which has been effectively dictating economic policy for Greece. Britain's exit from the European Union would be an amicable divorce. You know, we would take stock after a vote to leave, and when we set out we'd come to an idea of what our stall would be, we would activate Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, which is the legal kind of normal way of coming out of the European Union, and then there would be a 2-year period where we would get all our affairs in order, and then we would move out. And there's no reason that it should be particularly traumatic or difficult for anyone concerned. We'd be much better off as good neighbours and equal partners of the European Union rather than sort of awkward tenants.
Mr. Montgomery, we've got to leave it there. It's a fascinating debate to watch from afar. We hope whichever way it goes, it'll be for the best for Britain, but also for the world. Selfishly speaking, obviously, we don't want to see those shockwaves that some have been allowing us to fear.
Nothing to be worried about. There's nothing to be worried about.
OK, well, we hope to have confidence if indeed your side does win. Jack Montgomery from the LeaveEU campaign. In fact, that is a website, leave.eu, where a number of those arguments are spelled out. And you can check that out if you fancy, better informing yourself ahead of the big referendum in June. And you can email your opinions and questions to us, efmthismorning@gmail.com.
Of Project Fear were behind Mr. Longworth's downfall.
Well, remember, the problem here is that he was in a position as the executive head of that organisation, which is made up of members, and all of its members don't necessarily share his views, and they'd taken a neutral stance. In fact, when I heard him say it, I thought to myself, there could be trouble here. And obviously there has been, because he was suspended, not by David Cameron or anyone else. He was suspended by the executive of the organisation of which he was the head, and now he's thought it right to resign. And I think one has to be pretty careful if it's being suggested there's some kind of conspiracy. I mean, let's reject all these conspiracy theories. I mean, people, they want to have them after the 23rd of June in the Conservative Party, fair enough. But up until then, we have a duty to concentrate on the arguments which are absolutely central to the question, do we stay or do we go?
Well, Jack Montgomery is the Scottish spokesperson for the LeaveEU campaign group and joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
And was Mr Longworth the architect of his own downfall here?
I couldn't possibly say. I think it's interesting that a lot of people who were close to the government or former government ministers think that the BCC was leaned on, but there's no way of knowing whether or not that's true.
But did he make a mistake actually publicly giving his position, which was at odds with the neutrality of the wider organisation?
It's never a mistake to voice an honestly held and considered opinion in a personal capacity. There's been a lot of people on the other side of the fence who've been voicing their opinions. Think about all the 36 FTSE company chiefs who came out to say they backed the European Union. None of them consulted their shareholders on that. The CBI is openly in favour of the continued membership of the European Union, but they've not conducted a full poll of all their members. It seems to me sort of classic of the way this debate's being conducted. People are being told, if you're in favour of Brexit, keep quiet or there'll be consequences.
So, in your view, then, the British Chambers of Commerce should have done what? Just said these are his personal views. The organisation itself is neutral, but there'll be those amongst the BCC who share differing views.
Well, precisely, yeah.
As regards the other voices in all of this, we had the French President Francois Hollande saying he wants the UK to stay in the EU. He warned of consequences for immigration and the economy if we left. I mean, are these the big issues, do you think, that people will ultimately decide whether to vote one way or the other on?
Immigration and the economy will be the big issues, I think. Yeah, those are the two most important things to voters all over the United Kingdom. President Hollande saying there would be consequences was very vague. He was obviously doing Mr Cameron a favour because he made that absurd claim that thousands of people would be able to come from the Calais jungle to the United Kingdom overnight. I'm happy to see that that has since been sort of totally slapped down by the Interior Minister, who's in charge of immigration policy, who said it would be irresponsible, create a humanitarian crisis, and because the British control their own border, would only see a greater influx of people into France.
But do you accept that there will be consequences? There may well be consequences, as you see it, of staying as well, but that there will be consequences when it comes to the economy and when it comes to migration of a Brexit?
Well, yeah, there'll be positive consequences, I would have thought, from a migration point of view. We'll be able to finally control migration into this country by people who hold EU passports. In terms of the economy, I imagine there might be a wobble in the money markets or something in the short term, but we'll be much more capable of opening up our country to trade globally. We'll be able to shed ourselves of some damaging regulations, such as the Clinical Trials Directive, for example, and they'll end up being a positive benefit, just as John Longworth said.
But people point to Switzerland, for instance, and say there's a country that isn't a member of the EU, but still, because of its trading relationship and the deal it's negotiated with the EU, still has to pay money to the EU, doesn't have any influence, and still has to deal with the free movement of people. Would Britain not be in the same position, potentially?
I don't see why it should be. I mean, that's the position that the Swiss have chosen for themselves. The Swiss, interestingly, just a few days ago, formally withdrew their long-resting application to join the European Union, 10 years after they conducted a cost-benefit analysis, which figured out that joining would cost them 9 times more than their current arrangements. So it's obviously working for them. They're a rich, prosperous country. But there's other countries around the world, like, say, Mexico or South Korea, that have a relationship with the European Union based solely on free trade in goods and services. Some voluntary cooperation in areas where that's of benefit to both sides, and that's the position we would end up being in.
Well,
We're the European Union's single biggest export market. We would have enormous leverage over them in any kind of bilateral negotiation.
You say that's the position we would end up in, but actually that's not necessarily the case, is it? It's feasible here, as you point out, in terms of the deal that the British government would negotiate with the EU, that we could be in the same position as Switzerland, i.e. paying, having the free movement of people, but lacking the influence that we have at the moment.
It's a question really for the government. I mean, Mr Cameron says that we need to say what Brexit will look like, but he says he's going to stay on and negotiate it. So he needs to tell us what's his plan, what's the strategy he's going to pursue. It's irresponsible for him to say, you need to say what Leave's going to look like, when he's going to be the one who's going to be in charge of deciding what Leave's look like, and who is not making any contingency plans, probably because it would turn out they would be some quite good plans that we could come up with, and he doesn't want to have to disclose them under freedom of information. As I say, the Swiss, when they conducted their cost-benefit analysis, figured out that even their not ideal relationship works out 9 times cheaper than being in the EU.
Jack Montgomery, Scottish spokesperson for LeaveEU. Thank you very much for that. 18 minutes tonight.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.